Good evening, everyone. My name's Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today for an exclusive briefing on Ukraine's front lines with General Wesley Clark, moderated by former Atlantic Council President Jan Lodel. I'd like to offer a special word of welcome to our briefer, who is also an Atlantic Council Board Director, also to our distinguished guests. Thank you for being with us today, and to our audience watching online, especially all of those in Ukraine who are joining us, given the late hour there as well, via our live webcast. I'd also like to encourage all of you in the room, but those online, to follow the conversation and contribute your thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag #ACUkraine, hashtag #ACUkraine. Here at the Atlantic Council, we recognize not only the importance of Ukraine, but also the implications of the ongoing crisis. Ukraine's not just defending itself, as we all know. It's on the front lines of defending the order that has delivered security and stability in Europe since the end of the Cold War. That's why back in February 2014, the Council here stood up what we've called the Ukraine and Europe Initiative. This initiative galvanizes international support for an independent Ukraine within secure borders, whose people will determine their own future. And to advance this, the Council's work aims to strengthen Ukraine's security, preserve its territorial integrity, and advance its economic, democratic, and governance reforms. I'd like to extend just a special word of thanks to all the Council Board Directors who stepped forward last spring to help us stand up this initiative. I particularly want to thank George Chapisky and the Chapisky Family Foundation for their support, as well as leaders that we have with us from the Ukrainian World Congress. And I'd like to offer a special word of thanks to the Open Society Foundations for their support and cooperation in this effort. We're honored to have the Open Society Foundations as a partner in our mission to continue the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. But tonight, we're focusing on the security dimension of the crisis in Ukraine and the war. It was here on this stage in September 2014 that President Poroshenko here in Washington said at the Council that he asked for arms to, quote, win the peace. And it was in February just of this year that Jan Lodel and a group of others helped lead a process to produce a report that many of you have seen on preserving Ukraine's independence, resisting Russian aggression, what the United States and NATO must do. In this report, along with the Brookings Institution and the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, a team from the Atlantic Council called for the provision of lethal defensive weapons and $3 billion in financial assistance to Ukraine. So just 2 weeks ago, General Wesley Clark, founder and CEO of Wesley Clark & Associates, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and our speaker this evening, he was joined by Lieutenant General Patrick Hughes, a former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Lieutenant General John Caldwell, the former head of the Army Development Acquisition and Research Chief. And they traveled on a fact-finding mission to eastern Ukraine, where they met a group of military commanders, civilian and military leaders in Ukraine, including President Poroshenko. It's from that trip that we're going to hear his views tonight. Having served for 38 years in the U.S. military, wounded in Vietnam, reaching the rank of 4-star general, and receiving numerous distinguished honors for his service, including the Purple Heart and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, General Clark is an expert strategist and a sharp military mind, not to mention a Rhodes Scholar. I had the honor to watch him at work as he was commander of NATO forces and Operation Allied Forces over the Balkans. He travels to Ukraine regularly to assess the military situation and advise Ukraine's leaders. In February, after the fall of the key city of Debaltsevo, General Clark joined the Atlantic Council to brief policymakers and the media on the strategic consequences of that defeat. So we're delighted to welcome you back this evening and thank you for your leadership on this set of issues. Joining General Clark to moderate the discussion this evening is the Honorable Jan Lodel, Distinguished Fellow in our own Atlantic Council Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security and a former president of the Atlantic Council itself. Jan previously served as Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy and is a senior member of the National Security Staff. He's been an impetus behind much of the security work on Ukraine here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you both for joining us tonight. So without further delay, I want to turn the floor over to you, General Clark, to offer your thoughts on the briefing, and then Jan will join you on stage for a conversation.
Well, Damon, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and Jan, thanks very much for supporting our trip. The Atlantic Council has supported us over there. I was accompanied by Lieutenant General retired Pat Hughes and Lieutenant General retired John Caldwell. And I think both of them are here today. They've asked me to represent them in the initial remarks up here. And but I reserve the right to call on them for supporting information if appropriate and required. May I do that? So this was my personally my 7th trip to Ukraine since last March. The Ukrainians reached out to us through the Center for Strategic and International Studies, John Hamre, last year. They asked me to come over, and I've made several trips. But I was very impressed by what the Atlantic Council had done, and so we're very grateful for the sponsorship of the Atlantic Council and the Soros Foundation, which put this last trip together and allowed me to go over with my colleagues. While we were there, we linked up with several friends in Ukraine, including the Potomac Foundation, Phil Carber, who's also joined us in the room. And I want to just set the stage before I talk about the specifics that I found. So my personal connection to Europe and NATO goes back to the late 1970s when I was working for General Alexander Haig as his deputy, as assistant executive officer and speechwriter in Mons, Belgium. And so I learned from General Haig and the speeches I worked on, I learned deterrence. I learned how the United States handled the Soviet Union. I learned about the trade-offs between deterring the Soviets, how to work with China, how it fit with national policy, and how the individual views of nations in Europe factored into the deterrent equation. I came back to the Pentagon in '94. I was the J5 on the Joint Staff. And in that position, I was responsible for the Joint Staff relationships with NATO. So we did Partnership for Peace, we did the NATO enlargement planning at that time, and we did the negotiation of the end to the fighting in the Balkans. I went with Richard Holbrooke on his delegation, and then subsequently I became the NATO commander. We did Operation Allied Forces. Damon mentioned I had Russians under my command, and I learned in excruciating detail how different nations have different national perspectives of security and their needs. So during all that process, what we saw was in the 1990s, we saw an era when we believed the Cold War was over, and those ideas that animated the Cold War were gone. It was an era when anything seemed possible. I participated as the lead officer in the U.S.-Russian staff talks in the summer of 1994 in Moscow. We had detailed discussions of how things were. Now, I did see that the Russians still maintained a certain territorial overwatch of Europe. As one Russian general said to me in those staff talks, he said, "When will your NATO ships be in our home port of Riga?" And, of course, it wasn't their port. And I remember answering and saying, well, you know, it's a different country. It's not your port. I said, but the more you ask that question, the sooner the NATO ships will be there. And, of course, because those kinds of questions raise insecurities in Eastern Europe. The Pentagon's position in mid-94 at the time of those staff talks was we were opposed to NATO enlargement. But President Clinton made the decision that NATO enlargement would be a good idea, so we worked through the process of bringing Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland in. When I became NATO commander, they were in the process of joining, and I remember the first trip I made to Bulgaria, the Bulgarian foreign minister explained that NATO enlargement, she said, cannot stop here. She said, Bulgaria today is weak. Russia is also weak. But Russia will someday be strong again. And before that time, she said, Bulgaria must be a member of NATO. A couple of months later, I was making my first visit to Romania. And I had dinner with the Minister of Defense, a man named Babiuc. And so the subject of NATO enlargement came up. And he said, yes, he'd like to be a member of NATO. He'd like Romania to be a member of NATO. And I said, why? Does it have anything to do with Russia? because what we were saying at the time in Washington was that NATO enlargement would spread stability in Eastern Europe. It would be a good thing. It wasn't directed against Russia. It was just designed to promote peaceful harmony. Minister Babiuch said, of course it has to do with Russia. I said, well, have there been some incidents? Can you explain some of this so I can carry it back to my colleagues in Washington so they can understand Romania's perspective? So share with me some of these incidents. He said, certainly, he said, in 1878. And he began to recount Romanian history. And so there is this fear of what comes from Russia in Eastern Europe. And I saw it very clearly during the time I was there. I remember going to Moscow in the summer of '98, and General Gavashnin was the Russian chief of defense, and he said to me, sitting across the table, he said, you Americans are taking our countries in Eastern Europe. You want to sell them arms. He said, they're our customers. I said, well, they can buy weapons from whoever they want. We don't have any intention of taking them and selling them our weapons. That's not the purpose of this. And he said, you're taking our minerals to make us poor. So there was a certain mercantilist view in this line of thought. And I tried to work through this. You try on personal relationships, but you can't teach someone a course, a 3-semester, 4-semester course in macro and microeconomics sitting across a conference table. It just didn't convey. And so we never got past that. And in January of 2000, I was back in Romania. The Romanian chief of defense was a new officer in his position, and he explained to me that Russia was trying to block Romania's accession to NATO. And he explained to me why. So he pulled out a map, and it had the countries outlined in Europe, and it showed these arrows arcing from one country to another, well, they're geostrategic lines of force, he explained. And you can see them emanating from Russia and landing in Bulgaria and Romania and jumping from this country to that country. It looked like a sketch of a checkerboard. And he explained that this is how you understand Russia. I said, how did you learn this? He said he went to the Frunze Military Academy, and that's how they were taught. I said, but please, I understand what you're saying, but please do not show this to the Europeans because they don't think this way. They won't understand it, and you'll build a lot of resentment. Well, he didn't take my advice. He went to Brussels. He pulled out the map. He explained to everybody how Russia was trying to do this, and of course they didn't understand, and subsequently he was replaced as the Romanian chief of defense. I don't know if that mission in Brussels had anything to do with it or not. But what we're seeing today is a manifestation of that geostrategic mindset. If it's not theirs, they want it, and if it's ours, it's hurting them. And they view the world that way. We don't. We view the world as opportunities for trade, investment, personal growth, relationship building. We view that countries can work cooperatively and better the welfare of persons in both countries. But they don't see it in that way, and I don't think Mr. Putin sees it in that way. In 1999, he came to the inauguration ceremony of President Kuchma in November of 1999. He was the prime minister, and Yeltsin was ill. And he spoke at Kuchma's inauguration, and he said words to the effect that Ukraine and Russia are more than brothers. We are in each other's souls. Shortly after this, I was contacted by one of the high representatives from Poland who explained to me that this is code language for Putin attempting and planning to take over Ukraine. And they gave me several indicators of this. So this conflict in Ukraine goes back a long, long way. This is not something that just emerged after Mr. Yanukovych fled Kiev 14 months ago. This is a long process that's unfolding. And it's had one single focus. It's to bring Ukraine back into the Russian orbit, either directly or indirectly. That's the focus. So Dr. Carver and I made several trips. Our first trip was over there at the end of March of last year. And at that point, Crimea had been given to the Russians. We sat with the Minister of Defense, and the Minister of Defense said, well, I did what I was supposed to do. I called the Russian generals and said, please don't hurt our people. We're going to pull them out. You can have it. Just don't hurt our people.